Hello, my name is Simon Double, and welcome to Inside the Rails, a monthly podcast for horse racing enthusiasts everywhere. And as ever, I'm joined by my co-host, Phil Boyle from BG Racing, fresh from a recent success on the racetrack. Hi, Phil. How are you?
Hi, Simon. Yes, I'm all good, thanks. Grateful for having a quieter weekend just gone after a busy end to last week when obviously we were both at Windsor races in their syndicate showcase area at their racing league fixture. And then I was out early on Friday, the day after, to head down to Neil Mulholland's yard for a naming event for our new Milan mare. And from there, straight up to Wolverhampton to see Sajwan run late afternoon. I was in need of a relaxing weekend after that lot to catch up on some communications and, of course, prepare for recording Inside the Rails. But I don't think you had such a restful weekend as I did you? 2 runners up at Doncaster?
I did indeed, yes. I sometimes stop over when having runners in Yorkshire, but far too much on at the moment, so it's up and back in a day. I'll talk about the 2 runners later. Mixed fortunes. Delighted to say we have someone from an area of the industry we've not had before, and that's from one of the auction houses. We're very fortunate to have Jimmy George, Marketing Director from Tattersalls, Europe's oldest bloodstock auctioneers. But come on, Phil, what about the BG Racing horses? Mixed fortunes for you, I gather, as well.
Yep, absolutely. You're very right. Someone told me a few days ago that if you have ups and downs, the downs make you savour the ups even more, and the ups help you recover from the downs. And that's definitely been true for me this month. Listeners will probably remember I've been very disappointed with the running of our horse Sajwan over the last couple of months. So, yeah, it was a huge boost when Dynamic Kate returned from a breeding operation to win in fine style at Worcester.
Well done indeed. Well done. Delighted to see Dynamic Kate back in winning mode. A good time had by all, I suspect.
Absolutely. It was a brilliant evening. I had 8 or 9 shareholders with me up there. It was great to share the experience with them. There was plenty of hugs and pats on the back in the winner's enclosure after the race. And yeah, even better news was that Kate came out of the race well. She's in great form at home. And she only got a small increase from the handicapper, so she can still run in 0 to 100 races in the future. And all being well, she's due to run in such a contest again on Sunday, the 3rd of September, back at Worcester. So, yeah, I only gave listeners a few hours notice of her run last month because it was on the same day that the podcast was released. But, early listeners will get 3 days notice this time because her run's on the 3rd. She is quite small, so carrying top weight in that race might be a bit of an issue for her. But if she can handle that, I think she must have a really good chance of following up.
Yes, I saw she just went up £4. Just for the benefit of listeners, you mentioned 0 to 100 races. Just to explain this a little bit, that means that horses who can run in a 0 to 100 are for horses rated within that band. So Dynamic Kate is now rated 100. She would be top weight in a 0 to 100 race. But if there was another horse running against her rated 95, that would carry £5 less weight. And if there was one, for example, rated 90, that would carry £10 less weight, and so on and so on. I hope that gives listeners some idea when we talk about 0 to 100s or 0 to 95s.
That is spot on.
Now, dare I ask about Sajwan, who seemed to show promise when you first had him, Phil, but things not quite going according to plan.
Yes, indeed. He's definitely the down that has made the ups a bit sweeter. He ran twice in August. He was last at Yarmouth, and he followed that up by being last again back on the all-weather at Wolverhampton. Yeah, when we bought him, despite some good form, he was a really bad mover at home. He just looked like he was in discomfort all the time. So we put a lot of time and effort into sorting out various issues because we thought, obviously, that would lead to better results at the races. But it's starting to look like he might be feeling that racing was the source of his previous issues and he doesn't really want to risk himself. So, yeah, it's massively frustrating, very disappointing, and we might run him once or twice more just to try a couple of things, but I'm starting to think that we might have to find him a home outside racing and look for a replacement for him.
Yes, I've been in that place over the years, Phil. Unfortunately, they can't all be swans. Some of them are ducks, and some of them do fall out of love with the game. Now, on a brighter note, you mentioned a naming day for your new mare, and you talked about a Milan mare. Just to sort of clarify that's nothing to do with the horse coming from Milan. Maybe you can explain that a little bit. Tell us about the naming day anyway.
Yes. Bella Cavalla is her name. We had a lovely morning at Neil's yard last Friday. I invited our shareholders to nominate names, and then we voted on them, and we met last Friday to announce the winner. We didn't break a bottle of champagne over her head. I don't think that would have been a good thing, but that's what they do with boats, isn't it? But no, I think my shareholders must have decided that after I'd spent some time learning the correct pronunciation of Kirky from Stefano last month, they might wanted to give me a bit more Italian practice. So, yes, indeed, she's a daughter of Milan. So that's why I refer to her as the Milan mare. And Bella Cavalla is Italian for beautiful mare.
Oh, nice.
I think Bella Cavalla is correct, and I hope Stefano doesn't tell me later that I should be referring to her as Bella Cabello or anything silly like that. But however we pronounce it, let's hope she gives us some great days at the races in the future. Anyhow, enough of BG Racing. It's your turn to tell the listeners how brilliant it is when you own a share of one that wins a race. So tell us about Sharp Distinction.
Well, we're up to episode 34 of Inside the Rails, and we've had an Inside the Rails across the card double, because the day that Dynamic Kate won at Worcester, Sharp Distinction deservedly got his head in front for the first time at Yarmouth earlier on in the day. He'd been runner-up 3 times before, third on 2 occasions, and he really has been threatening to win of late. And win he did in an epic duel with a Charlie Johnston horse called Bailey's Kelstar, an epic duel during the last 2 furlongs. I mentioned a trainer of the runner-up as the Johnston horses, formerly Mark Johnston and now Charlie Johnston. You know, that yard is the last you want to be up against in a duel, as the horses from that yard are so tough and often very difficult to pass. But I'm delighted to say we did prevail by a head to land that Inside the Rails across the card 50-1 double.
Indeed. Brilliant to see. Well, I say see, we were on our way to Worcester, so we listened to Sharp Distinction's race in the car on the way up. And yes, with it being a close finish, there was an eager wait for the commentator to confirm that he'd managed to win. And that kick-started our delight that you had a winner straight onto WhatsApp to message you some congratulations. So, yeah, brilliant time. Now, this Saturday's trip to Doncaster, not quite as good. You had 2 horses and presumably 1 goat with you. Tell us about Tarantino and Woody.
Well, Gary the goat certainly behaved himself. I can't quite say the same for Tarantino, who is definitely stretching the patience of his trainer and racing manager, never mind the owners. He's a horse with loads of ability, but he is his own worst enemy. So he ran at Newmarket earlier in the month, but reared up as the stalls opened and lost several lengths. In the end, on ground, as it turned out, which was too soft, he finished 6th of 12. Didn't run too badly, actually. On Saturday, though, at Doncaster, he travelled up to the races with Gary the Goat in the horse box and was actually so chilled out he was falling asleep. That's Tarantino, not the goat. But not for the first time. Tarantino was difficult to saddle at the starts. And according to his jockey behind the stalls, he was being a clown. He was fractious, virtually cantering on the spot and trying to barge into other horses. The stalls opened and he actually did jump okay this time, but he was far too free in his race. In other words, he was doing too much and he beat just 1 home. Not a good day at the office, but we're trying something different. We're going to run him very quickly at Leicester on Wednesday, just 4 days after the Doncaster run. And we're hoping that will take the fizz out of him. And we're going to put a hood on him during the race. You never stop trying new things in racing, do you, Phil? Anyway, we'll see how that goes.
Indeed, yeah. I did see him going back and forth at the start on Saturday. I was a bit worried he might be stressing himself a little bit too much. So let's hope that quick turnaround works. But tell us about Dancing in the Woods.
Well, like Dynamic Kate, he's had a wind up, a fairly minor one. That's his second one during the last year. He ran a good race on his first run since the simple win procedure when he was 7th at Doncaster. I was pleased with that. We're coming back to ground again, Phil. Sorry about this. Again on ground, which was certainly not good to firm as advertised by the clerk of the course. It was riding on the soft side of good, as backed up by the slow race times all afternoon and the comments of the 3 different jockeys who rode for Amy Murphy at the meeting. Frustrating.
Yes, I do feel your pain, but I'm sure further discussion on ground conditions will have a negative impact on your stress level. So let me steer you away from that subject. I mean, I do hope our chat about runners will spark some of our listeners to consider shared ownership. Yes, we in some of the BG Racing and Solario Racing shareholders have had to endure some disappointments in the last month, but we've also had those brilliant successes. And I hope we've done enough justice to just how special it is when you're lucky enough to part own a winner, that we might have encouraged a couple more people into shared ownership.
Racegoers at Windsor last Thursday on a racing league night had that opportunity to find out about shared ownership. It was very well organised by Great British Racing, so well done to them, to Windsor Racecourse, and also give a mention to the PR agency Holland Alexander. All three organisations worked well together to put on a great show for everybody. There were trade stands, which both you and I had, and you and I were both interviewed by Sky Sports' Leona Mayer. Both of us were again interviewed by our old pal Frankie Foster, and I did a piece with Natalie Green live on ITV Racing. So, Mr. B, I think on this occasion, I think I can claim the bragging rights with 4 interviews to your 3.
Indeed, TV viewers might be getting bored of seeing us pop up on their screens, but it was great to be located alongside you again in the Syndicate Village. That's always a help. We can watch each other's stands while we're each off chasing the cameras, trying to get on TV again. And on a serious note, I really enjoyed the evening. I met and chatted to lots of really nice people. I actually sold a shareholding of Bella Cavalla on the night, which is very unusual. Usually people come back to me at a later date. And one couple, indeed, came to chat to me because they'd seen me on the big screen with Frankie, and they were surprised to learn that getting involved in ownership was something that they could actually afford to do. So I do hope they might also join the BG Racing gang in the coming days.
Well done you, well done you. Now, I didn't sell any shares on the night, but I did run a competition, and that certainly helped to produce a lot of contacts. And when I got home, I had some emails from people who'd seen the interviews on the television, I think on ITV, and wanted info on Solaria Racing. Oh, and by the way, listeners, there are very limited shares available in the unraced 2-year-old Baron Barolo, who's going to make his debut very soon, hopefully in September. I'm very excited about him. So look, do go into the Solaria Racing website to find out about him, or get in touch directly with me, either by phone or email. That's the plug over. We don't do many, do we, Phil? I guess we ought to move on to some racing news. And gosh, there's been plenty of that going on. The whip rules, they never seem to go away, do they? The discussion about that. Jockeys wanting the reinstating of saunas at the racecourses so they can lose weight. The one news item for me, which is the most serious by a country mile, affordability checks on people wanting to have a bet. Now, Phil, I know we sometimes have mini rants, but it's all in good humour. But this affordability checks issue is very serious for racing and indeed the way we lead our lives. So, in terms of racing, lots of prominent owners and punters are walking away from betting. They're saying we've had enough of this, having to prove how much we earn and providing bank statements and proof that they can afford to have a bet. It's having huge repercussions on the money which flows into prize money from taxes on bookmakers' profits. But secondly, on a more general level, it's a massive intrusion into how we lead our lives. Last night, I went to Hemel Hempstead to see the film Oppenheimer with friends, a film I can thoroughly recommend, by the way. I'm also lucky enough to have a fabulous Art Deco cinema in Berkhamsted called The Rex, which I love going to. Would the government or some quango like to check if I have the financial wherewithal to afford going to the cinema? Phil, your thoughts on some of the news items, particularly affordability checks?
I'm not going to wade into the debates on the whip rules and saunas on racecourses. What I will say is I do find it a huge shame that various areas of racing seem to be slipping towards wars of words again rather than all pulling together. I am a great believer in people working together to get a solution they can all operate with, and it would be nice to see people sitting down, actually listening to each other and trying to see the other person's perspective before having a discussion to see what can be agreed. I just don't think digging ourselves into entrenched positions and being quite rude and dismissive of other people's views is in any way helpful in terms of achieving a good way forward. And I think it's sad that this seems to be creeping in, yeah. That aside, I do agree with you. The one thing we have to look at is the danger to the sport presented by overzealous affordability checks. Listeners might remember Lee Mottershead was our guest here 18 months ago, and he was concerned about that subject back then. And if anything, there's probably even more to be worried about now. There is a Gambling Commission consultation out there right now, and if some of what's being proposed in there ends up being implemented, then I honestly think the sport we love could be in big trouble.
Yeah,
we're not talking about wanting to look after people that have a gambling problem. Of course, we all want to do that. This is about the proposed mechanism for doing it. And if I speak on a personal level, I've got a spreadsheet. I can identify every bet I've placed in the last 5 years. I know to the penny how much I've won and lost. And I can tell you quite categorically that I fully understand what I can and cannot afford in terms of my betting. But despite that, having read what's been proposed, if it gets enacted in the way that it might be, I would have to provide my bookmaker with all sorts of personal financial data to continue having a bet in the future. Now, I wouldn't do that. I don't think it's any of their business. So it would probably lead me to simply stop betting. And our sport relies so much on the levy that bookmakers pay on bets placed on racing. And without it, our poor prize money will end up being even less. And we simply can't afford to drive hundreds, probably thousands of people like me away from betting. It would be disastrous for the sport. So we all know there's other ways bookmakers can identify people that are or they're prone to becoming problem gamblers. And it's essential that what we implement actually achieves that without catching people that don't have a problem and will not have a problem in the crossfire.
Very well put, Phil. Very well put. Many listeners may remember Mick Shannon, former England footballer and turned trainer. Mick Shannon said very recently over affordability checks, the world's gone mad. So listeners, seriously, if you feel this is something close to your heart and you're sharing Phil's and my concerns about affordability checks, I urge you to go into the Racing Post website where you can find out how to register your concerns in the consultation process on the gambling review, and also do write to your MP. Now, Phil, I'm delighted to say we've got on the phone our special guest, Jimmy George from Tattersalls. Hi, Jimmy. How are you?
Hi, guys. Yeah, very good form. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining Inside the Rails. We do appreciate you joining us. Before we get into the interview proper, Phil and I have just been discussing affordability checks, a big issue in the racing news. Just wonder, Jimmy, if you had any thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, it's an issue that I think tends to arouse fairly strong feelings, and I think quite rightly. I think quite simply it's an extraordinary invasion of personal liberty.
Absolutely.
Cloaked in a veil of social responsibility, which I think is hideous, by politicians who, it would appear to me, have little or no understanding of how damaging this could be to so many other livelihoods. It's almost speechless at times, considering the thought processes that go on behind stuff like this. It's worrying for society as on so many different levels. You know, not just relating to affordability checks. It demonstrates a society that appears to have lost touch with individual and personal liberty.
Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for those thoughts. Look, you're the well-known face of Tattersalls, Europe's oldest and biggest bloodstock auctioneers. You're marketing director, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Can you tell us, for the benefit of our listeners who perhaps aren't quite so au fait with auction houses, tell us a little bit about the background of Tattersalls?
Yes, well, it's a long and reasonably illustrious history. Tattersalls was founded in 1766 by Richard Tattersall, so more than 250 years of history behind the firm. It was the first firm of bloodstock auctioneers in the world. It was founded in Hyde Park Corner. As you can imagine, it's not a great place to sell thousands of thoroughbreds these days, but obviously in those days they weren't selling thousands. They were selling handfuls of thoroughbreds. They were selling hunters. They were selling hounds. There was very much a hunting background to the original Tattersall story, but as everybody knows, for a very long time now, it's been purely thoroughbreds, and that's the way it will remain. And at the moment, in the modern day, well, we've been based at Park Paddocks in Newmarket since the 1800s. Although the offices actually only moved to Newmarket relatively recently. Some of the guys that I first worked with when I started here in 1986 had actually started in the office in Knightsbridge, and in those days, so the day-to-day office was in Knightsbridge, and everybody moved up for the sales en masse, and mostly stayed in the Rutland Hotel on the High Street in Newmarket, and it was a sort of travelling roadshow. But for obvious reasons, that wasn't terribly practical. But as I say, remarkably lasted until the late 70s.
You mentioned 1986. You've been in racing since that year. Initially, I believe you worked on publications such as Thoroughbred Breeder magazine and Pacemaker. Did you always want to work in racing, Jimmy? What's the Jimmy George story into the racing industry?
Well, actually, Tats was my first stop. I came here straight from Exeter University with a feeble degree in history and politics. Actually, I don't think I'd got the degree by the time I started here. I was so excited at the prospect of my miserable salary that I left before the end of term. And so my first sale at Tats was the 1986 July sale. And it's changed an awful lot since those days. But I did 3 years, and then I left and went to work for sort of what remained of the old Pacemaker stable of publications, because it was going through a little bit of a change. So you had the Thoroughbred Breeder, the Directory of the Turf, and my boss was a chap called Nick Robinson, and I worked there for 5 years. And as I say, it was a period of transition for Pacemaker, and actually got bought by Haymarket publications in the meantime. And I ended up as editor of Pacemaker for about a year. Which was great fun. So I'd say that was in 1993, and then I came back to Tats in 94.
Now, I mentioned that you're marketing director at Tattersalls. Can you tell us about the current role and what it involves?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly wide-ranging brief. I mean, I always simplify it as talking nonsense and smiling.
I'm sure there's more to it than that.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder, but it's look, I mean, our role on the marketing side is primarily to bring as many people to Tattersalls as we possibly can, to maintain the profile of the company, not only domestically but on a global scale as well, to bring as many buyers as we possibly can to the sales. Doesn't matter whether it's book one of the October yearling sale or December breeding stock sale, the Scepter Sessions, or book 3 or 4 of the October yearling sale. Every sector of the market is as important as the other, and it's our role is to try and ensure that we have buyers that wish to come to Tattersalls at all levels.
And I guess in your role as marketing director, you do quite a bit of travelling. Apart from Tattersalls, what other bloodstock sales do you enjoy attending, and why?
Yeah, I mean, quite understandably, I view our sales as the pinnacle for anybody wishing to attend any bloodstock sale. But last week, or well, it's not really last week, it's the week before last, I was out in Saratoga for a mixture of racing and combined with their 2-day August yearling sale, Fraser Tipton's August yearling sale at Saratoga, which is a prestigious affair. I guess it's got a great feel to it. Saratoga is a sort of showcase for pretty well the best of American racing every year over their summer meet, which runs for about 6 weeks. A lot of quality racing. So I arrived on the Thursday night before the sale, which started on Monday, and it's a fairly steady diet of graded stakes racing on the Friday, the Saturday, and the Sunday before the sale. So you can mix some fantastic racing with a high caliber yearling sale. There's an awful lot of people. The Saratoga is a sort of mecca for American race fans, and so the crowds are great. The enthusiasm level is about as high as it gets out there. And walking around the racetrack in the morning, seeing the trainers, seeing the horses work, it's a fun few days. It's a fun few days mixed in with a high class yearling sale. So,
Jimmy, a couple of questions from me, if I may. Simon and I started this podcast to try and promote more people into shared ownership, syndication, racing clubs, etc. Have you ever been an owner yourself, either a sole owner or within a partnership or a syndicate?
Sole owner, never, but I have had legs in horses with a couple of very good friends for quite a while now. It's been a great ride. It's been a lot of fun. We've enjoyed some good fortune over the years, and like everybody, you experience the ups and the downs. But I would be a very enthusiastic proponent of anybody getting involved in racehorse ownership, as you would imagine. And I think basically you aim to get involved at the highest level you possibly can. It doesn't matter whether your budget is a couple of grand or a couple of million. You aim for the stars, whatever your budget is, and with a bit of good luck and some good people around you, it can be the most magnificent fun.
Absolutely. And you're right about the ups and downs. Simon and I were highlighting some of our own personal ups and downs a little bit earlier on in the podcast. What about the bloodstock sales? Is that something that you'd like to see more people getting involved with? And if so, what advice would you have for first-time attendees and buyers?
Yeah, I think, at Tattersalls, we're very keen to encourage people to come to the sales, whether you're professionally involved or whether you're an owner or whether you're a member of a syndicate. It's great theatre. The sales are where the whole process of racehorse ownership begins. They're fascinating, and the more engaged you can become in the sales, the more knowledge you glean, the more fascinating and the more fun it becomes. I think it's like most things. The more you understand, the more information you can glean. It opens a lot of doors. It opens your eyes to all sorts of things, and you never, it's all a constant learning curve. We're all still learning, and not a day goes by that you don't see something in the bloodstock world or the racing world. You think, oh, okay, yeah, interesting, and we'll all collate information in a different way. But attending a bloodstock sale is a fascinating part of the sport, and it is part of the sport. I genuinely believe that it is. It's almost like I sort of constantly see the fascination that people have in the football transfer market at certain times of the year, and you sit there and think, well, that's not part of football, but it is. The movement of players between teams, it affects the way they perform. It affects your, it's part of your engagement in the sport of football. So is the buying and selling of horses. It's an absolutely fascinating and crucial part of the sport. So we always encourage people to come and engage in the sales. And I think the most important part, certainly the first time you come to the sales as an aspiring owner or as an aspiring member of a syndicate, is to just try and acquaint yourself with a few basics to start with. That sounds awful to say it, but the boring, turgid stuff at the front of all the Tattersalls catalogues, which may be either the conditions of sale or guides to sales to give people a few handy little pointers. They may seem incredibly boring, but just a brief glance through some of the stuff at the front of any Tattersalls catalogue is a good place to start, just to give yourself a little bit of understanding of the process that you will discover and keep discovering every time you come to a bloodstock sale.
There's some really good advice there, Jimmy, for people going to the sales, particularly for the first time. So thank you for that. Now, finally, a question we like to ask all of our guests. If you could change 3 things in British racing for the good of British racing, what would they be? Actually, do you know what? Because you travel the world quite a lot and racing is a truly global business, we'll do it slightly differently. We'll do it slightly differently this time. Maybe give us 2 things to improve British racing and 1 for world racing.
I guess in terms of change, sometimes you have to focus on what might be realistically achievable rather than a fantasy list. Any of us that have been engaged in British racing for, well, it doesn't matter whether it's a year or 10 years, 20 years, 30, 50 years, will obviously not be oblivious to the prize money issues we all face, or that British racing has faced since the early 60s, when, of course, bookmaking became legal. There's so many sort of tired old bits to this, and greater minds than ours have wrestled with prize money issues. But realistically, and there's always one sector of British prize money that I feel we can realistically achieve change in, and it's specifically with 2-year-old maidens, and it ties into something that Tattersalls have been doing for about the last 7 or 8 years, which is the Book One bonus scheme, where every yearling that goes through Book One of our October yearling sale is eligible for a £25,000 bonus when they win their 2-year-old maiden or novice. That's in Britain and Ireland. In Britain, these maidens have to be class 2, 3 or 4. So they're decent enough 2-year-old maidens or novices. Now, I strongly believe that if the powers that be concentrated on this sector of British racing, that we could achieve meaningful change in the levels of prize money in that sector of the racing programme in Britain. I think the first check that an owner receives is the most important. And if we could set a goal of making sure that every class 2, 3 or 4 2-year-old maiden or novice in Britain was worth £25,000 or £30,000, it would make a massive difference to the way owners engaged with the sport and their first experience of winning prize money. If the first check you get is, significant as opposed to £4,000 to £5,000, you feel a little bit warmer and tinglier about the whole process. And I think that the reality is it's very difficult actually for a horse to win more than one race. So if the first win you achieve, you go, oh, fantastic. We've paid the thick end of a year's training fees, or we've paid the thick end of what this horse cost as a yearling. Make a massive difference.
So that's the prize money angle covered very well. Is there something else you'd like to see change for the good of British racing?
It all really sort of tails back to prize money, but I think the levy does need looking at. We keep being told that levy reform is on the agenda, on the political agenda. It's always hard to know what's on the political agenda these days. But so I'm not sure I view that with any great confidence. But the gross profits on British racing model does seem flawed to me. I think it is a debate that needs to be had very seriously as whether the levy should return to turnover-based model, and certainly include bets placed by UK punters on racing abroad.
And finally, is there anything that you would like to see change for the good of racing worldwide?
Again, it's probably not terribly original, but you can't help thinking when you go racing abroad, as I do, and have obviously been racing in all sorts of interesting parts of the world, that a joined up rule book for a sport that takes place in every continent in the world would certainly make sense. I suspect we're so far down the line in many respects that that's an awful lot easier said than done. But global sports should have global rule books.
Jimmy, fascinating stuff. Look, we've loved having you on, somebody who's truly immersed in the industry, both nationally and internationally. So thank you so much for joining Inside the Rails and for your time.
Yes, thank you.
Well, Phil, yet again, another fascinating guest from the world of racing, somebody who really knows the industry well. I think we know where Jimmy stands on affordability checks, don't you? One of the other fascinating things that I took out of the interview was his take on prize money with 2-year-olds, trying to improve that. I thought that was an interesting slant on the prize money debate.
Yeah, absolutely. It was good to hear from Jimmy. I thought he was very interesting, and it gave us a good insight into the bloodstock sales game. It'll certainly open my eyes a bit more next time I'm going to the sales. Obviously, that rounds off another episode of Inside the Rails, but it wouldn't be rounded off without me doing my usual plead for people to give us a few good reviews, like us, follow us on your podcast platform of choice, and also get in touch with us. You can always do that via our contact details in the show notes or on Twitter at Inside the Rails.
Well, that just leaves me to thank co-host Phil Boyle from BG Racing, our very special guest, Tattersalls Jimmy George, producer Callum Ronan from Callum Ronan Creative, and of course, you, the listeners. The whip rules, to sauna or not to sauna, and intrusive affordability checks for people who like a flutter. The world's gone mad. But for the owners of recent winners Dynamic Kate and Sharp Distinction, they'll tell you There's no feeling like it. This is Simon Double from Solaria Racing saying, thank you for listening to Inside the Rails, and until next time, goodbye.